Okay, so this is a short video, one of four, looking at user experience design and some of the processes involved in that. So we're going to start off at a bit of a high level and then delve into some of the ways and means that you can undertake the process of user experience design in any project, be that a traditional graphic design or product design project, or be that a project looking at transforming the way that water is supplied in remote parts of Africa. Okay, so we've got a great here quote from Paul Rand. An understanding of man's intrinsic needs and the necessity to search for a climate in which those needs can be realised is fundamental to the education of the designer. So we're looking at man's intrinsic needs and how we can resolve them as a designer. And in this instance, we're talking about user experience design. It's really important to understand this is not user interface design. This is about creating a user experience through the process of design. I'm not a big fan of the word user. It tends to invoke, thinking about either computer science or drugs. And so I think a much more neat is either a human-centered design, or I'm really trying to encourage the term humanity-centered design. I think that's something that we should push forward. Not something that I originally coined, but it's certainly something I've heard and I think is a great way to think about this type of user experience design, but think of it more as humanity-centered design. Now there's a great field guide that I recommend everyone takes a look at from IDEO, who we'll come back to in a minute. This is a field guide to human-centered design. It's a design kit project and looks at some ways, again, that you can undertake design processes with a human at the center. So let's remember that design is the creation of a plan or convention for the constructing of object, system, or measurable human interaction. And so we want to create something that has this measurable human interaction, and through a system, object, or construction, a plan. And we can do this through the process of design thinking. Okay, so this is a term that's worth checking out and finding out as much as you can about. It's a term coined by Tim Brown in IDEO. So this is something to look up. You can look up the IDEO websites. You've got ideo.com, ideo.org, and openideo.com, which delve into more of these details about how they undertake design thinking in their processes and how you could undertake it into some depth. So the first thing to remember is that there's a few things here. It's about making a difference. It's finding relevant solutions that have positive impact. And it's thinking that gives you faith in creative abilities and a process to transform difficult challenges into opportunities. So that's the core principle. And there's a few key points that are made from this. So fundamentally, design thinking should be optimistic. So it's a belief that you can change no matter how big the problem is or how small the time or budget is. Yeah. So designing can be an enjoyable process, so it should be optimistic that there is an ability to change things, even if it's a small amount of time, a small budget, or an insanely large problem. It's collaborative. So this is something really, really important, to realise that it is not a sole endeavour. Design thinking benefits from multiple perspectives, multiple creativity, and it's stuff that should obviously boost your own work and allows you to solve those challenges much better than with one. So that's something really important. The other thing is it's experimental. So design thinking gives you permission to fail and learn from your mistakes, because you come up with new ideas, get feedback, and then iterate. So the idea is that something is never solved or finished. It's always a work in progress. So even at a moment in the project where things may not be going according to plan, this is all part of the iterative process of improving the design solution for whatever the problem is that you are trying to achieve. Okay, so design thinking really is all about learning by doing things. Okay, so this picture explains the process, and there's lots of processes, lots of images that try and explain design thinking. Key to remember is it's not a linear process in any shape or form. Okay, so the idea is that you can empathize on and define your problem. You might then ideate on that issue, you might prototype and test, and of course these things go back into ideating new ideas, maybe redefining the problem that you've had, maybe reimagining the problem, learning about the users and going right back to the start. So it's not a linear process, and this process doesn't have an end. At various stages you are testing implementations of solutions to the problem you are trying to design for, but you will always be using insight in those moments to capture more data and provide more feedback. Here's another little diagram. This is from IDEO's own book here, which I think is really neat. And again, think of this as going, back and looping to the beginning around here. So we have a bunch of phases that you can go through that are discovery, interpretation, ideation, experimentation, and evolution. And these phases sort of fan in and out in terms of focus. So at the initial discovery phase, obviously you're gathering tons and tons of data. You're trying to find out as much as you can about what it is and how you might go about approaching it. You're then thinking about how you can learn from that and interpret that into your own solutions, opportunities, or even just reframing those things. So that's where you start to focus down, and then you start to think, okay, with this opportunity or this meaning, can I generate new ideas and refine those? So again, we fan out from that starting point. That's followed by experimentation, which allows us to have prototypes and gain feedback. And of course, then at the end, when we've maybe got some feedback on that smaller output, that will give us some more information to try and evolve. And of course, that phase is really back into a rediscovery phase based on the learnings and the tracking that we've done at various prototype points. So one way to think about this in this whole is to connect the idea of design thinking into what's called a package known as Lean UX, which I think is really interesting. We're not going to go into much detail about the entire process, but Lean UX is a process that uses design thinking at its core. It then embeds on top of that design thinking an agile working process. So this comes more from software development, but it's an agile working process. So this is a particular type of process that is actually distinct from another process, which is no longer really in favor, called waterfall. So that's the agile process. And then also the reason it's called lean user experience is that it borrows some mentalities from startup culture. So there's a bunch of things here. The book Lean UX by Jeff Gotthelf is really good and well worth checking out, and really explains all of that detail. Okay, so let's start with a small exercise in how we start to undertake this process of design thinking, and it touches on some of the areas that the Lean UX touched on. In this instance, we're going to think more about practical approaches. So this quote is great. I love this quote. Roger Kipling: "I kept 6 honest serving men. They all taught me all I knew. Their names are what, why, when, how, where, and who." So this is what we're trying to learn. We're trying to find out things. And so if we think about those questions, what, why, when, how, where, and who, and constantly ask those through our project, this can really kick us off with this first phase of discovery within the design thinking process. And in fact, you can use this at various phases in that process to question feedback, to question prototypes, to question ideas. So there's a couple of specific ways we can do this without just thinking about those terms, is to think about some open questions. So there's this issue here of like 5 whats. So you can ask these questions of every project using these particular whats. So what problem are we aiming to solve? Just write that down. What assumptions have we made? So we're going to come back to that later about how you figure out those kind of things, but it's really good to write all of those down. What do we know already about this? So this is, again, another set of types of assumptions. What are the current designs, user journeys, and scenarios? And we're going to come back to user journeys as well. What are the competitors doing in this space? Super important. Like, what else are other people doing to tackle this problem? What are their motivations to tackle that problem? So there's 5 specific whats you can ask of the issue you're trying to tackle. And then here, there is 5 whys. So ask this of your problem. So here we've got the issue of the car's battery being dead. Okay, so the vehicle will not start. So why won't the vehicle start? Okay, the battery is dead. Okay, so then it's just quizzing that in and not repeatedly asking why, but provoking deeper thinking. Okay, so but why is the battery dead? Is it old? Is there something misfunctioning? So if it's the alternator that's not functioning, then we might be questioning, well, if the alternator's not functioning, why doesn't the alternator function? Surely that should be working. That's what's supposed to be there to charge the battery. And of course, we find that the alternator's belt has broken. So why would the belt have broken? And again, that's why is the belt broken? Well, the alternator belt was well beyond its useful service life and had not been replaced. Well, surely, you're supposed to replace that alternator belt at regular intervals. So the question is why? Well, if you look here, as the vehicle was not maintained according to the recommended service schedule. So this is a very simple process, but it's really key and important to think about the problem that you're undertaking, because if we stop at why the battery is dead and we just go and get a brand new battery, we certainly wouldn't have found out the real issue here, which is that the vehicle needs to have a proper service schedule. And in fact, what we needed to purchase at this point was not the battery, it was definitely the alternator. In fact, it might not have even been the alternator, we may have only needed to replace the belt. So the cost in there, just by asking those first 3 whys, and then ensuring that if we're going to replace the alternator belt, we don't want to be replacing it for no reason because this vehicle is not being maintained. So it's putting in place a maintenance schedule would actually be the way to solve this problem in the long term. So that's really important, So it's about framing and reframing the questions in ways to provoke deeper thinking. That's super, super important. Okay, so here's a little example of the National Arts Organisation. So they asked some questions, and so they wanted to increase their education work. Yeah. So the thing was, it was trying to look at what they wanted to do. So here they've got, why would you enter into education? So it's to broaden reach. Why would they want to broaden reach? Well, because they're a national organisation. Why be national instead of local? That's within their remit. Okay, so why did you make that remit? Because that's how the funding works. Why go for funding? Yeah, because funding equals clout and respect, which enables us to put in whatever the focus into a national conversation. So this conversation here with the Arts Council meant that rather than try and transform classroom practice or inform curriculum design, need to look at options to increase the respect that they sought. Yeah, so they said we want to get into education work, but actually that wouldn't do what they really wanted to do by asking those questions. So that's really, really important. Okay, so for part 1, the activity here is use those 5 whats and 5 whys to delve into a problem or a company's project or a company's organisation and see whether you can find out some interesting approaches to what might be the real problems that you want to design solutions for. And that's the first phase of design thinking, is to start thinking deeply about the problem you're trying to solve and whether the problem really is providing more education or curriculum, or in fact going and talking to funding organisations.